Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here with you today to discuss the implementation excuse me, of the nuclear agreement with Iran and our P5+1 international partners. In my testimony, I want to directly address the central question raised by this hearing: what are the policy implications of providing tax-related sanctions relief? For example, will such relief result in an increase in Iranian state-sponsored terrorism? Before addressing the issue of possible tax-related sanctions relief, it makes sense to step back and consider the agreement itself and what it accomplishes. My professional judgment is that this agreement is the strongest, most intrusive non-proliferation agreement ever negotiated. This positive assessment is not mine alone, but rather shared by American nuclear weapons scientists, retired diplomats, including 3 former U.S. ambassadors to Israel, and retired military officers. Support for the agreement has included a broad and bipartisan cross-section of the U.S. national security establishment, including Republican national security luminaries such as Brent Scowcroft and Colin Powell. In addition, Israel's Atomic Energy Agency and more than 40 retired Israeli defense and government officials have endorsed the agreement, as well as our European allies. This agreement reduces Iran's stockpile of uranium by 98%. It restricts Iran's enrichment levels. It reduces Iran's installed centrifuges by 2/3 and goes beyond the additional protocol, the current gold standard for IAEA verification. This agreement provides for 24/7 monitoring of Iran's declared nuclear facilities and a first-ever expedited procedure for investigating any suspicious undeclared facilities. Many of its provisions, including snapback sanctions, are unprecedented. The agreement quadruples the number of inspectors over what had been operating in Iran prior to November 2013, and it's difficult to think of a simpler but more powerful measure of the difference that this agreement makes. If one were to ask virtually anyone whether increasing the number of IAEA inspectors in Iran by 400% is a good thing, the answer would undoubtedly be yes. With that in mind, I want to shift to the issue of tax-related sanctions relief. And by way of background, it should be remembered that the U.S. imposes 2 broad categories of sanctions on Iran. Primary sanctions are those that prohibit American individuals and entities from engaging in business with Iran. Secondary sanctions prohibit foreign individuals from interactions with Iran. This agreement provides relief primarily from secondary sanctions, not primary sanctions. With limited exceptions, sanctions prohibiting American trade and investment in Iran will remain in place for years to come. Now let me focus on the policy implications of providing tax-related sanctions relief in particular. Based on a review of the evidence, I judge that even a full waiver of tax penalties on foreign-owned subsidiaries, as unlikely and ill-advised as that may be, will not by itself generate new trade or investment in Iran. 1, American primary and other sanctions will remain in force. In addition, the architecture created by CISADA and ILSA, particularly as it relates to money laundering, terrorism, and other issues, continues on the books and with enforcement. Number 2, few subsidiaries of U.S. companies will want to do business in Iran. American-affiliated companies are not welcome in Iran, and the Supreme Leader has made that clear in his recent letter to President Rouhani. In addition, the recent arrest of an Iranian-American businessman will further dampen interest by American firms and their subsidiaries. Finally, let me address the broader issue of sanctions, relief, and terrorism. There is this larger critique offered by some opponents of the agreement, suggesting that it will lead to an increase in state-sponsored terrorism by Iran. In my judgment, both the assumptions of this critique and its conclusions are deeply problematic. First, the intelligence community has assessed that new funds will be devoted to rebuilding Iran's economy, not to terrorism. The LA Times reported that, quote, a U.S. intelligence assessment predicts that Iran's government will pump most of the expected funds into the country's flagging economy and won't significantly boost funding for militants, close quote. Number 2, Iran received some $16 billion in sanctions relief during the 2 years of the interim nuclear agreement, yet there is no evidence pointing to an upsurge in Iranian state-sponsored terrorism. Number 3, the U.S. continues to enjoy a wide variety of tools to combat terrorism with or without an agreement. Number 4, no American wants Iran to support terrorism, to oppress human rights, or to engage in any number of those objectionable activities. But the only thing worse than Iran that does these things is an Iran that does these things and has nuclear weapons. And absent sanctions relief, there will be no agreement, and Iran's nuclear program will be unconstrained. In conclusion, this agreement represents a historic achievement that is arguably the strongest multilateral nonproliferation agreement ever negotiated. It will advance the national security of the United States, as well as the security of our friends and allies for decades to come. And nothing related to tax-related sanctions relief alters that conclusion. I thank the committee for providing me the opportunity to share these views.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh, and thank all the witnesses. It's obvious that you have more knowledge and more experience than we have time in your presentation.